My own son and his wife tried to steal my home and lock me away forever. They thought I was just a confused, helpless old woman they could easily control, isolating me from the world while tricking me into signing away everything I owned. They were so condescending, so sure they had won, but they made one critical mistake. They had no idea about the secret I was hiding behind my closet wall, or that one tiny device that would record their entire monstrous plan and give me the most satisfying revenge imaginable. The sun in my Palo Alto backyard has a particular quality, a warm golden light that makes the lemon trees look like they're studded with jewels. It's the same sun that warmed this yard when my late husband David and I first bought this little house, back when the valley was more about orchards than algorithms. That afternoon, the light felt different, almost theatrical. My son Evan and his wife Daphne were hosting what they called a small family get-together, which really meant a stage for Daphne's online life. She drifted through the garden, her phone held in front of her like a sacred object, narrating her every move to 1,000 invisible followers. Her voice was honey sweet, talking about the importance of family values, of cherishing our elders. Then she was beside me, her arm looping through mine. "And here's my wonderful mother-in-law, Helen," she cooed to the screen. "Isn't she just glowing today?" Her grip was surprisingly tight, her manicured nails pressing into my arm just enough to feel like a warning. I smiled for the camera, the practiced, pleasant smile of a woman my age, but I could feel the disconnect. Her smile never touched her eyes. It was a bright, brittle thing, all for show. In the days that followed the party, their concern for me seemed to amplify overnight. They called it Operation Care. It started with the small black cameras that appeared on the corners of the ceiling, gifts from Evan for my safety and security. He said he and Daphne could check in on me from their phones just to make sure I was all right. It felt less like a comfort and more like a watchtower. Then came the Wi-Fi. Daphne changed the password to something long and complicated, explaining with a patient sigh that the old one was too simple and I was vulnerable to scammers. She wrote the new one on a sticky note that promptly vanished, so I had to ask her any time I wanted to go online. My world began to shrink in these small, practical ways. My weekly calls with my sister in Oregon suddenly stopped connecting. When I asked Evan about it, he looked concerned and checked my phone, telling me the signal seemed weak. The next day, Daphne cheerfully announced she was screening my calls, blocking all the telemarketers and spam so I wouldn't be bothered. Every act of isolation was wrapped in the beautiful paper of love, every restriction presented as a gift. I was becoming forgetful, they said. I needed protecting. The centerpiece of their plan arrived on a Tuesday, carried in by Evan himself. He sat me down at the old oak dining table, the one David and I had eaten at for 40 years, and spread a thick sheaf of documents across its surface. Daphne was conveniently out at a yoga retreat. This was a son's job. He spoke in low, serious tones about their new estate planner, about simplifying my accounts, about setting up a trust to handle my future medical needs so I would never have to worry. The words were a soothing balm to protection, security, legacy. He pointed to signature lines, his finger tracing over dense paragraphs of legal jargon I couldn't possibly decipher. I was tired. A part of me, the part that had raised this boy and trusted him implicitly, wanted to believe it. This is what good sons do, isn't it? They take care of their aging mothers. So I picked up the pen. The scratch of the nib on the heavy paper sounded unnaturally loud in the quiet house. With each signature, I felt a small, nagging flicker of doubt, a cold whisper I dismissed as the paranoia of old age. I was just being difficult. I was just being a burden. I signed away my home, my independence, and I didn't even know it. That night, sleep wouldn't come. It wasn't just the summer heat. It was a deep, thrumming restlessness in my bones. The house was silent, wrapped in the artificial security of the new cameras. I got up for a glass of water, walking down the familiar hallway, my feet silent on the worn floorboards. As I passed the study, I saw a sliver of light from under the door. I paused, hearing the low murmur of a voice. It was Evan, his voice stripped of its confident, reassuring tone. It was a hushed, frantic whisper, tight with a kind of fear I had never heard in him before, not even when he was a child. I leaned closer, my heart starting to beat a little faster. "The payment is due on the 1st," he was saying, his words sharp and clear in the stillness of the night. "No, she doesn't suspect a thing. Once the house is in the trust, we can use it as collateral." There was a pause, and my blood ran cold. "We have 3 weeks," he said, his voice cracking on the last word. 3 weeks before they foreclose. The words hung in the air, seeming to crystallize in the darkness. Foreclose. Collateral. She doesn't suspect a thing. Suddenly, the air in my own home felt thin, impossible to breathe. The warmth of the old house evaporated, replaced by an icy dread. The cameras on the ceiling, the silenced phone, the signed papers, it all snapped into a horrifying, crystal-clear picture. This wasn't a home anymore. It was a cage, and the door had just been locked from the outside. By the way, if you're enjoying the story so far, please consider subscribing so you don't miss what's next. We'd also love to hear your own story if you'd like to share it with our community. Now let's get back to it. I didn't sleep. I returned to my room and sat in the dark, the words I'd overheard replaying in a loop. Collateral foreclose. She doesn't suspect a thing. The shock didn't turn into tears or rage. It was stranger than that. It was as if the emotional part of my brain had been flash frozen, and another part, a dusty, methodical part I hadn't used in years, whirred to life. The part that used to design experiments and analyze data. The betrayal was a fact. The desperation was a variable. The 3-week deadline was the control. My next steps would be the experiment. When the sun came up, I was no longer just Helen, the aging mother. I was a scientist observing a problem. By the time I came down for breakfast, I had my hypothesis, and I had my new role to play. I shuffled into the kitchen, my hand trembling just a little, a deliberate tremor. I let my eyes look distant and unfocused. I was the frail, confused old woman they believed me to be. Daphne was already there, scrolling through her phone with a frown of intense concentration, probably counting the likes on her sunrise yoga post. Evan was reading the financial news, his face tight. I let out a small, wistful sigh as I sat down. They both looked up, their expressions a perfect blend of practiced patience and weary concern. I made my first move. I gestured vaguely toward the living room, where a dusty shelf of David's old science journals still sat. I spoke to Evan, my voice soft and a little reedy. "You know, dear," I began. "I was looking at one of David's old books this morning. It was about microbial fermentation." I paused, letting the silence stretch. "It was so funny, it reminded me of that little biotech company your friend, what was his name, Mark, invested in. The one that went bust. What was it called again?" I looked at him with what I hoped was an expression of benign, fluttering curiosity. But inside my mind was a steel trap. I knew that failed startup was where Evan had lost the last of his own money, a catastrophic loss that had likely pushed them over the edge. The effect was instantaneous and deeply satisfying. Evan, who had been lifting his coffee cup to his lips, choked, spraying a fine mist of coffee onto his tablet. Daphne's head snapped up from her phone, her carefully composed mask of serenity shattering for a single glorious second, revealing a flash of pure animal panic in her eyes. They exchanged a look, a frantic, terrified communication that said everything. They were caught. They were exposed. and they had no idea how I knew. Evan, wiping his mouth, stammered first. He said it was just a bad investment, a calculated risk that didn't pay off. He was trying to frame it as a strategic failure, a normal part of the Silicon Valley game. But Daphne, ever the victim, jumped in immediately. She said it was a total scam, that their friend Mark had been taken for a ride by con artists. Her version absolved them of any poor judgment. Their stories collided in midair, one a bad investment, the other a scam. The contradiction hung between them as thick and obvious as the smell of burnt toast. My hypothesis was confirmed. Their desperation was profound, their lies were clumsy, and their conspiracy was built on a foundation of sheer panic. They were amateurs, and I knew I could beat them. The key was to move before their panic solidified into a better fortified prison. Daphne's obsession with her online persona was my window of opportunity. That afternoon, she was in the garden phone on a tripod filming a 20-minute video about the mindful art of pruning roses. While she was narrating her spiritual connection to a thorny bush, I went to work. In the back of David's closet, inside an old shoebox filled with forgotten cufflinks and tie pins, was a small black burner phone. David had been a quiet man, but he was a man who believed in contingency plans. I had never touched it before. I took it to my bathroom, the one place without a camera, and turned it on. I only had one number memorized that wasn't family. I dialed. She picked up on the second ring. Her voice was the same as I remembered, sharp, clear, and impatient. Sharma. I kept my own voice to a whisper. Anya, it's Helen. There was a beat of silence, and then her tone softened instantly. Helen, are you okay? I didn't have time for pleasantries. I need you to look into something. Code word Nutribiome. They're watching me. I heard the distinct sound of typing on her end. Another moment of silence, then, I understand. Stay safe. I'm on it. The line went dead. That was all I needed. Anya Sharma had been my brightest protégé 30 years ago. Now she was one of the most feared patent attorneys in the state. If anyone could help me, it was her. My little probe had rattled them more than I could have hoped. They must have talked after I went to my room for my nap. Their fear made them sloppy, but it also made them more aggressive. That evening, they came to me together, their faces arranged in masks of deep, sorrowful concern. Daphne held my hand and told me that my doctor had called. She said he was worried about the effect of blue light on my sleep patterns and had strongly recommended I avoid screens after 6 p.m. With that, Evan gently took my laptop and my tablet, promising to keep them safe for me. They were cutting off my access to the outside world. The next morning, the doorbell rang. It was a woman named Maria, a caregiver Daphne had hired to help me during the day. Maria was pleasant enough, but her eyes were watchful. She wasn't a caregiver. She was a guard. I was no longer just a target. I was a prisoner in my own home. The feeling of being completely sealed in should have terrified me. Instead, it clarified things. I retreated to my room, the one place that was still my own. I went to my old sewing kit, a memento from my mother. Tucked beneath spools of thread and packets of needles was another of David's little contingencies, a voice-activated recorder no bigger than my thumb. I checked the battery. It was full. I slipped it into the pocket of my housecoat. My home was bugged, my communications were cut, and I had a warden. The experiment was entering a new phase. It was time to start gathering data. My new life as a frail, forgetful old woman began. It was a role I took on with the same dedication I once gave to my research. I would forget Maria's name, calling her Martha one day, and Mary the next, always with a flustered, apologetic smile. I'd be watching a simple television show with her and ask with wide-eyed confusion, who the main character was 20 minutes into the episode. I let her dote on me, helping me button my cardigan or fetch a glass of water I could have easily gotten myself. I was a ghost in my own home, a harmless, fading presence. And it worked perfectly. Through the lenses of the little black cameras, I watched Evan and Daphne watch me. Over the first few days, I saw the tension leave their shoulders. The forced, brittle smiles they gave me softened into something more genuinely condescending. Their earlier panic after my question about the startup had been a fluke they decided, a random flicker in a deteriorating mind. Their arrogance returned, and with it their carelessness. They started speaking more freely, their voices no longer hushed whispers but confident, casual tones. They felt secure, they felt safe. Which was exactly what I wanted. I didn't know the full suffocating depth of their desperation then, but I could feel it radiating from them like heat. Later, after it was all over, I would piece together the fragments I'd overheard and paint a picture of it in my mind. I can see Daphne so clearly sitting alone in her gleaming white SUV, parked just outside the ridiculously expensive private school her children attended. I imagine her phone buzzing, not with a message from a friend, but with a cold automated notification. Final notice. Tuition payment overdue. I can see her frantically scrolling through her Instagram feed, a gallery of curated perfection. She'd see a photo of a woman she called a friend, smiling on a yacht in the Mediterranean, and her face would tighten into a mask of pure envy and despair. I learned later about the threatening emails from credit card companies, the final demands from a personal lender. I even found a bank statement they'd carelessly left out that showed a balance of less than $500. Their desperation wasn't just about money. It was about the social death that comes with financial failure in a place like Silicon Valley. They were terrified of being exposed as frauds, and that terror had turned them into monsters. My caregiver Maria had a predictable routine. Every afternoon at 2 o'clock, her favorite soap opera came on. She would settle into the recliner in the living room, completely engrossed for a solid hour. That was my window. I would tell her I was going for my afternoon nap, shuffling off to my bedroom with a weary sigh. Once the door was closed, I would move with a speed and purpose that would have shocked her. My bedroom looked ordinary with its old quilt and photos of a happier time. But the back wall of my closet was false. David had built it for me years ago. Behind it was not a hiding place, but my life's real work. My laboratory. It was a small, climate-controlled space, filled with the gentle hum of incubation units and the clean, earthy smell of microbial fermentation. This was my sanctuary. On stainless steel shelves, hundreds of carefully labeled petri dishes contained my secret nutribiome. It was a revolutionary nutrient-dense paste, a single spoonful of which contained all the balanced nutrition a human being needed for a day. It was my answer to world hunger, the culmination of 30 years of quiet research. This was the legacy I wanted to leave behind. While Maria watched fictional characters betray each other on TV, I would power up the burner phone, connect it to a small satellite modem, and send encrypted data logs and research notes to Anya. She was already working furiously, laying the groundwork for the patent application that would protect my invention from the world. The performance of my steady decline had lulled them into a state of absolute confidence. One afternoon, believing I was sound asleep in my room, they settled in the kitchen for coffee. The kitchen was directly below my bedroom, a fact of household geography they had apparently forgotten. I lay perfectly still on my bed, my hand resting in the pocket of my housecoat, my thumb hovering over the tiny recorder. Their voices drifted up through the floorboards, clear as a bell. At first, they were mocking me. I heard Daphne do a cruel, high-pitched imitation of my confusion, and they both laughed. It was a cold, ugly sound. Then their conversation turned practical. Evan was talking about the timeline, how the sale of the house could be finalized within a month once the trust was fully leveraged. And then Daphne asked the question I had been waiting for. She asked what they were going to do with me. I heard the scrape of a chair, then Evan's voice devoid of any emotion at all. He said he'd been researching long-term care facilities in the Central Valley, where the costs were lower. He mentioned one in particular, describing it as perfectly adequate. I knew what that meant. It meant the cheapest, barest bones place they could find. They were talking about my future, my life, with the same detached pragmatism they'd use to discuss selling off a piece of unwanted furniture. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. I just lay there in the quiet of my room as the tiny device in my pocket silently recorded every single word of their most critical mistake. With the recording safe in my pocket, the world shifted. I was no longer a victim waiting for the axe to fall. I was a strategist holding the winning card. For 2 more days, I continued my performance. I was the model of gentle, pathetic decline. I let Maria help me with my meals, I complimented Daphne on her gardening, and I listened with a vacant smile as Evan talked about the stock market. I was letting the line go slack, giving them the illusion of freedom before I set the hook. They grew even more confident, their conversations around me filled with mundane plans and casual cruelties. They had completely written me off. On the 3rd morning, I decided it was time. I found them in the kitchen, and with a trembling voice, I asked if we could have a healthy family meeting after dinner. I told them I had been thinking a lot about the future and wanted to talk. They exchanged a look, a triumphant knowing glance that said, "Here it is. She's finally ready to give in." That evening, we sat at the old oak dining table. I took my usual seat, the one I'd sat in for 40 years of family dinners, holiday feasts, and quiet morning coffees with David. I made myself look smaller, hunched over slightly, my hands clasped nervously in my lap. I looked at my son and the woman he married, and I felt a profound and weary sadness for what they had become. I began softly, my voice barely above a whisper. I told them I knew they were planning for my future, and I understood they were worried. I knew they thought it was time for me to be somewhere safer, somewhere I could be looked after properly. I was setting the stage, handing them the script they had written for me. "I know what you're planning," I said, a single rehearsed tear rolling down my cheek. "But I want to hear it from you. Please, just be honest with me." They took the bait perfectly. Evan launched into a gentle, patronizing speech about my cognitive decline and the risks of me living alone. Daphne chimed in, her voice dripping with false sympathy, talking about the financial burden of in-home care and how selling the house was the most responsible option for everyone. They were so smooth, so practiced. They built a beautiful cage of lies around me, all for my own good, of course. I let them finish. I let the silence settle in the room, thick with their deception. Then, moving with a slow, deliberate motion, I reached into the pocket of my housecoat and placed the small digital recorder on the center of the table. It was so small, so insignificant, but it landed with the weight of a grenade. They both stared at it. Evan's brow furrowed in confusion, but Daphne's eyes widened, a flicker of that now familiar panic returning. I didn't say a word. I simply pressed the play button, and their own voices filled the room. It was the recording from the kitchen. First, Daphne's high-pitched, cruel imitation of my confusion, then their shared ugly laughter. The sound of it made them both flinch as if they'd been slapped. The recording continued, their words cold and clear. Evan's voice unemotional and pragmatic, talking about the timeline for the sale. And then, the final damning part, their discussion of the care facilities. I heard my son's voice calmly describe a place in the Central Valley as perfectly adequate followed by Daphne's suggestion that they find one even cheaper to maximize their profit. The blood drained from Daphne's face, leaving it a sickly ashen gray. Evan stared at the recorder as if it were a venomous snake, his mouth slightly agape, the color gone from his cheeks. He looked like he'd been punched in the gut, all the air forced out of him. The recording played on a clinical monument to their betrayal, and in the silence that followed, I saw the complete and utter destruction of their world. The confession, when it came, was not an apology. It was an eruption. It was the sound of a dam breaking. Daphne broke first. A choked, guttural sob escaped her lips, and then it all came pouring out in a torrent of shame and terror. She wasn't speaking to me, but to the universe, to the crushing weight of her own failure. She sobbed about the overdue tuition, the threatening letters from the bank, about the mortgage, the second loan they had taken out, just to keep up with their friends. She talked about the shame of seeing pictures of their peers on vacation in Tuscany, while they were secretly selling her jewelry to make a credit card payment. It was a raw, unfiltered look into the heart of their desperation, the terror of being seen as a nobody in a world where image was everything. She confessed to the fraud, to manipulating me, to the cruelty, admitting it was all born from a place of abject panic. Evan just sat there silent and broken his wife's confession, shattering the last remnants of their conspiracy. He didn't deny a word of it. He couldn't. We had all just heard the truth. I let her desperate, ragged sobs hang in the air for a long moment. I let the full weight of their pathetic, self-inflicted misery settle over the table. Then with a quiet click, I pressed the stop button. The sudden silence was absolute. In that silence, the frail, weeping old woman they thought they knew vanished. I sat up straight, my back rigid, my hands resting calmly on the table. The confusion and fear were gone from my eyes, replaced by a cold, clear authority they had never seen before. My voice, when I spoke, was perfectly level, devoid of heat or pity. "Thank you for your honesty," I said. The words were a slap, a dismissal of her hysterical confession. They both stared at me, their faces a mixture of confusion and a new dawning horror. They were realizing that the woman they had been plotting against did not exist. "Now," I continued, my voice cutting through the tension, "I will be arranging one final meeting. You will both attend. You will arrive on time, and you will do exactly as I say." I looked from my son's broken face to his wife's tear-streaked one. My legacy will not be this house. My legacy is something you cannot even begin to comprehend. I paused, letting the words sink in. And your future, which you have built for yourselves with your greed and your lies, will not be my problem. I stood up from the table, leaving them there in the wreckage of their plot. Stripped of their lies, powerless, and utterly, completely terrified of what was to come. The week that followed our confrontation was the quietest I had ever experienced in that house. Evan and Daphne moved like ghosts, their faces pale and drawn, their eyes filled with a new kind of terror. It was no longer the frantic panic of being in debt, but the cold, helpless dread of the condemned. They were polite. They were obedient. They were waiting for the axe to fall, and the waiting was its own form of punishment. I used that week to coordinate with Anya. Everything had to be perfect. On the appointed day, I told them the final meeting would be at 1 o'clock. I instructed them to be dressed presentably. When they walked into the living room, their faces were tight with anxiety, expecting to see a team of lawyers or perhaps a psychiatrist. What they saw was far worse. Sitting in an armchair opposite me was a man they instantly recognized, Marco Gin. His face was a common sight in the tech world, a Pulitzer-winning journalist famous for his brutal, incisive exposés on the hypocrisy of Silicon Valley culture. Next to me on the sofa sat Anya Sharma, her posture radiating a calm, lethal competence, a thick legal portfolio resting on her lap. I was dressed in a simple but elegant navy blue dress, the one I used to wear to scientific conferences. I was no longer a victim or a prisoner. I was the host. I saw the trap spring shut in their eyes. They couldn't run. They couldn't make a scene. I introduced everyone with a serene smile. I explained to my son and his wife that Marco was a celebrated journalist interested in telling a story about innovative approaches to elder care. I told them he wanted to hear all about the wonderful proactive way they were managing my transition into my golden years. Daphne's face, already pale, became a waxy, translucent white. Evan looked like he was going to be physically ill. But they were trapped. Their entire lives were a performance, and now they were forced to give the performance of a lifetime with the highest possible stakes. To refuse would be an admission of guilt. So they sat and they began to lie. They stumbled through their well-rehearsed talking points about family values, about proactive estate planning, about the importance of community support for seniors. It was a pathetic, desperate final act, and I let them play it out, their voices hollow and trembling in the quiet room. As Evan was explaining the benefits of the trust they had set up for me, I held up a hand to gently interrupt him. I turned to Marco, who had been listening with a professionally neutral expression. I told him that the story they were telling was a lovely one, but it wasn't the real story. The real innovation happening in this house, I explained, had nothing to do with elder care. I asked Anya to open her portfolio. From it, she produced a simple, sterile-looking container and handed it to me. I placed it on the coffee table in front of Marco. Inside was a small amount of a thick, beige-colored paste. I told him its name, Nutribiome. And then I told him what it was. I explained with the passion and precision of a scientist who has dedicated her life to a single noble purpose, that this paste was my life's work. It was a complete, perfectly balanced source of human nutrition created through a unique microbial fermentation process I had developed over 30 years. I told him its purpose was not to make money, but to end global malnutrition. As I spoke, I watched his face. The professional neutrality dissolved, replaced by a genuine, intense curiosity. He leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the container. He had come here expecting a simple story about family drama, and he had just stumbled upon something that could change the world. He was hooked. My legacy was established. Now it was time for their reckoning. With Marco's own digital recorder now running on the table next to mine, I laid out the truth. I told him the real story. I spoke not with anger or self-pity, but with the dispassionate clarity of someone presenting research findings. I detailed the campaign of isolation, the installation of the cameras, the confiscation of my laptop. I described the coercion, the mountain of legal documents, the way they had exploited my trust. Evan, his face turning a blotchy red, tried to protest, stammering that I was confused, that my memory wasn't reliable. He was playing his last pathetic card. But before he could finish, Anya calmly opened her portfolio again. She didn't argue with him. She simply handed Marco a file containing copies of the fraudulent power of attorney, the deed transfer, and the bank inquiries they had made to leverage the house as collateral. The paper evidence was irrefutable. And then, for the final brutal blow, I reached forward and pressed play on my own recorder. Their voices filled the room again, cold mocking and utterly damning. Marco Jin listened, his expression shifting from intrigue to shock, and finally to a look of profound and undisguised disgust. He had heard everything he needed to hear. The judgment, when it came, was swift and silent. It wasn't in a judge's gavel or a lawyer's summation. It was in the look on Marco Jin's face as he looked at my son and his wife. In that single expression, they saw their entire world crumble. They saw their social standing, their carefully curated image, their future in this valley of appearances all turn to ash. I let the silence hang for a moment before I delivered the final consequences. I informed them that Anya had already filed the paperwork to have the fraudulent documents nullified. The house was, and always had been, mine. I told them I would not be pressing criminal charges. Their crimes were born of a weakness of character that no prison could fix. Their punishment, I explained, would be the truth. It would be the story that Marco was now going to write. I looked at my son, the man who had traded his mother's love for a desperate grasp at status, and at his wife, who had sacrificed her soul for the approval of strangers. They were pale and trembling, two empty husks waiting for the end. "The world deserves to know what real innovation looks like," I said, my voice clear and steady for Marco's recorder, "and what real desperation does." After Marco and Anya left, an unnerving quiet settled over the house. Evan and Daphne didn't leave right away. They just sat there on my sofa, two statues in the ruins of their own making. There was nothing left to say. Eventually, they stood up and walked out without a word. I didn't watch them go. I didn't need to. The judgment had been delivered, and now all we could do was wait. The article was published 2 days later. Marco had titled it "The Grandmother, the Startup, and the Unspoken Goodbye." It was a masterpiece of journalism weaving together the story of my life's work with the pathetic, tawdry tale of my children's greed. It was fair, it was factual, and it was absolutely devastating. I had expected it to get some attention, but I was unprepared for the explosion. It didn't just get published, it went viral. My quiet suburban life became the center of a national conversation about elder abuse, about the toxic culture of Silicon Valley, and about what it means to care for family. Evan and Daphne became instant villains, their faces plastered everywhere. They became memes. Pictures of Daphne from her influencer days gushing about family values were put side by side with quotes from the article detailing their cruelty. They weren't just disgraced. They were a cultural punchline, the ultimate symbols of performative virtue. The fallout in their own lives was swift and brutal. I didn't seek out the information, but in a town like this, news travels. I heard from a neighbor that Evan was fired from his job within a week, his tech firm unwilling to be associated with the scandal. Daphne's carefully curated online world, her only real source of identity, was consumed by a firestorm of public outrage. She had to delete all her accounts, effectively vanishing from the digital world she so desperately wanted to conquer. The community they had sacrificed everything to be a part of turned on them completely. They were ostracized, whispered about in the very coffee shops and yoga studios where they had once held court. Within a month, a for sale sign appeared in front of their over-leveraged house. I heard they had to sell it at a significant loss just to escape. They moved somewhere out of state to a place where no one knew their names. I felt no triumph in this, only a profound and weary sadness. They had been given every advantage, every opportunity, and they had traded it all for an illusion. Their punishment wasn't a prison sentence. It was simply the natural consequence of their choices, a new reality they had built for themselves, brick by pathetic brick. While their world imploded, mine began to blossom in ways I had never imagined. The article hadn't just exposed a crime, it had revealed a dream. The story of Nutribiome captured the public's imagination even more than the family drama. My phone, now free of Daphne's screening, began to ring off the hook. But it wasn't my sister or my old friends. It was venture capitalists, research universities, and philanthropists from around the world. They didn't just see a scandal, they saw a solution. With Anya's brilliant legal mind guiding me every step of the way, we turned down the multi-million-dollar offers from corporations. That was never the point. Instead, we established the Nutribiome Foundation, a nonprofit with a single clear mission to manufacture and distribute my invention to famine-stricken regions and disaster zones completely free of charge. My modest little house, the one they had tried to steal, became its first headquarters. The living room where my public reckoning had taken place was converted into an office. The garage became a packaging and shipping center. The house that had once felt like a gilded cage was transformed into a bustling hub of innovation, compassion, and hope. I was no longer just a forgotten old woman. I was a humanitarian, a scientist, and the founder of a global mission. Months have passed since then. The noise has faded, replaced by the quiet, satisfying hum of meaningful work. My secret lab is a secret no more. It has been expanded, and it is no longer a lonely place. I am surrounded now by a team of bright, passionate young scientists who share my vision. They call me Dr. Helen, and they listen with an earnest respect that brings tears to my eyes. This afternoon, we had a breakthrough, a new technique that will double our production capacity. One of my young protégés made a joke, and we all burst out laughing, the sound echoing through the lab, full of genuine joy and camaraderie. It was a sound I hadn't realized how much I had missed. From my desk, I can see a small, framed photo of David. He's smiling, his eyes crinkling at the corners. I know he would be proud. In the end, I reclaimed so much more than a house. I reclaimed my work, my purpose, my identity, and my joy. I took the pain my own children had inflicted upon me and transformed it into a gift for the world. I have secured a legacy not of wealth or property, but of nourishment and compassion. And in doing so, I finally found peace. Helen's story teaches a quiet but powerful lesson about true worth. Her children built their lives on the fragile foundation of appearance, believing value was in a house and the perception of others. Their power was a hollow shell easily shattered by the truth. Helen, meanwhile, cultivated her strength in secret, not in assets, but in her purpose, a legacy of compassion meant for the world. In the end, her greatest victory wasn't about punishment. It was about revealing the profound difference between a life built on what you have and a life built on what you give.